Hello and welcome to the Halcyon review show. My name's Lorne Rise. I'm going to be a host for this episode, and on this episode let's touch on a game that's caused just as much controversy as it has disappointment. Star Wars Battlefront II, a game by EA and DICE that sought to take the elements from the first installment of their reboot of the franchise, namely good multiplayer, insanely good graphics and sound design, and establish a story mode, campaign mode, that would hopefully feed into the canon of Star Wars in a meaningful and satisfying way. And in my personal opinion, I loved the original Star Wars Battlefront games. The space combat in particular was a source of fun for me and my friends, but in retrospect, the combat and space conquest missions, I should say, were fun in their own right, albeit repetitive to a certain degree, with certain mechanics that I wasn't ever really a fan of. However, with this installment came a fresh new set of expectations, with the story mode being as at the forefront of the marketing campaign as it was. And really, for me, the success or failure of this game hinges on that aspect, not necessarily on EA's choice of, let's say, questionable business practices, and including microtransactions in a game that really didn't need it, and more to the point, added microtransactions that were more in line with FIFA, which has been accustomed to that kind of transaction method for nearly 10 years now, as opposed to the Star Wars fans who are used to getting exactly what they pay for. So on this edition, let's try and set that to one side for a second and focus simply on what kind of quality of game we're talking about here. This is the Halcyon review of Star Wars Battlefront II.
The Emperor is dead.
So what happens now?
We retaliate, Commander. The Empire will assault the very foundation of the rebels' pathetic belief in themselves. Tell me, Aint, what is the source of their belief?
Hope.
Correct.
So let's begin with the core element of this game, and the element that I'll be scrutinising the most. Its gameplay. You can tell from the get-go that this game has its focus squarely on the multiplayer, as it should be for a Battlefront game. However, the bulk of my experience focused on the inner workings of the game and the single-player experience. Starting with the campaign, you take on various characters throughout the Star Wars mythos, from Luke Skywalker to Leia to Lando to Han. Disappointingly, no, the lightsaber characters still have a vague feel to them, with the strikes feeling light and not impactful at all. However, the deflect mechanics, along with the force abilities of each character, do serve to make them feel as formidable as they should be. Coming back to the in-game combat, the shooting contrasts the lightsaber combat in that it feels impressively thematic and each weapon feels like it packs a punch. The game limits you to one weapon at a time, which can be frustrating when wanting to adapt to different combat scenarios. However, this is mitigated by the fact that it seems very easy to hit headshots on the hordes of stormtroopers you'll face. This is realistic to a degree in that if you manage to plant one between the peepers, then they'll drop like a bad habit. However, this somewhat spoils the nature of the combat when you find yourself acing headshot after headshot while traversing through the game's levels. Speaking of which, while they're incredibly detailed, the levels don't have a great deal of interactivity or depth to them, with very little in the way of level destruction. There are collectibles such as battle cards and other trophies, but I found myself searching for these less and less as the game went on. Other aspects of combat include your droid, which can stun enemies and open doors. You have a partner AI throughout most of the game, but with no way to interact or command them in a squad mechanic similar to Mass Effect. And the most original concept the game puts forward in your configuration is the battle cards, which can become somewhat formulaic once you decide on your preferred playing style. These will range from things like grenades to health buffs to other ways of mitigating damage, but otherwise aren't tremendously original. This leads me to believe the in-game combat is, to be frank, somewhat generic. However, when you get behind the cockpit of the various ships available in the space battles, I feel the game comes into its own a little more, with the game feeling like a super polished and much improved version of the TIE Fighter or Rogue Squadron games, which in of itself is a massive compliment. The movement of the ships, the controls, the multiple abilities unique to each fighter, the lock-on mechanics, the debris and the layout of each level is wonderful and perfectly captures the feel of what it must be like to be a fighter pilot in this universe, especially when you switch views into the tremendously detailed cockpit itself. One negative though is in some of the story missions there are walking segments that are there purely for expounding on the situations the characters are in, which is not the best storytelling device in the world. One in particular with Lando where you simply walk through a level with no interaction at all, which could have been covered in a simple cutscene. There are various challenges in offline mode that add a little more in terms of activities once you're done with the story, but the multiplayer is what's going to keep you going here. Overall, the game feels well polished and balanced. It's somewhat generic at times, sure, but it has just enough of a unique touch that makes it feel set apart from the standard first or even third person shooters, given that you can change the viewpoints, and coupled with the powerful heroes and the space battles, the game is great fun to play in 45 to 60 minute bursts. And with the multiplayer aspect adding a tremendous amount of replayability, this is a very well designed and polished game, if not a little too clinical and lacking in true inspiration at times. So with the gameplay out of the way, let's touch on the perhaps most polarizing aspect of this game beyond the microtransactions, its story and characters. The new campaign mode predominantly follows the adventures of Iden Versio, an Imperial commander of Inferno Squad, and daughter of a high-ranking Imperial Admiral, set after the events of the destruction of the second Death Star and running up to the events of The Force Awakens and perhaps beyond. Unfortunately, the game ruins its interesting premise from the get-go by switching allegiance from the Empire to the Alliance within 3 missions. While this is a disappointment, the story in of itself isn't terrible, with Iden encountering various members of the Star Wars mythos as she goes, and while at times there is a sense of convenience about the encounters and the speed with which she becomes familiar with our favourite characters, overall, it's a serviceable story that only really kicks into gear towards the latter part of the game, and only really hits an emotional note right at the death and the beginning of the DLC expansion Resurrection. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the story was probably built to ensure that while players got a taste of playing as the villains, ultimately, being owned by Disney, they weren't quite comfortable with letting you play the gaming equivalent of The Empire Strikes Back from the shoes of Darth Vader. There are high points in the game, sure, but not as a result of the story. It's usually when you're visiting places you recognise from the movies rather than moments of emotional intent from the characters or from the narrative itself within the game. The characters of Iden and Del, her lieutenant and companion, are not that engaging, and their love story comes out of left field, given until they kiss, they seem more like colleagues and friends, and then BAM! At the end of the game, they kiss and bang eventually for reasons. Iden in particular is a little odd given she sheds more emotion at the destruction of the Death Star than leaving her father to die on a ship, and somehow missed the fact that the Empire was evil her entire life before they started shooting lasers at her home planet, making her seem somewhat naive and unsympathetic. The game leans heavily on her, and to my mind, this might have been a prime example to make Leia or Rey the main characters, if you wanted to have a rebel-centric story while remaining canon. If you wanted to give a new and fresh experience from a dark side perspective, it should have been kept a darker game with perhaps multi-layered story points if you wanted to allow players the moral choice, similar to Knights of the Old Republic or Jedi Knight. This was ultimately axed in favour of a traditional good guys versus bad guys story. It is underwhelming and drags on at times, and it's not a tale that will live long in the memory, unfortunately. And so, with that out of the way, let's talk about the presentation and design of this game. From the standpoint of looking and hearing this game, it's a fantastic example of wonderful design and implementation of a thematic and immersive experience for Star Wars fans. The soundtrack is sublime, the backgrounds are detailed and have such a feel of authenticity and attention to the subtle nuances of this universe. The in-game animations are smooth and realistic, and the cutscenes with the facial animations are among the best I've ever seen. However, while generally speaking the voice acting is very well done in this game, oddly enough, Luke's voice actor has an appalling likeness to Mark Hamill, and somewhat spoilt the section where you play as Luke. Speaking of which, the choice of characters and classes is wide, but the enemies you face in this story are lacking in depth, and the tactics employed don't tend to vary much with the exception of a few moments where the number of enemies threatens to be overwhelming and therefore requires a bit more stealth in the gameplay. The menu system and UI are both well designed, and while the levels are lengthy and provide plenty of game time, the loading times of this game are criminal to say the least and put Skyrim to shame. And it's worth noting that the level design in this game is somewhat linear and disappointing considering again the vast scope this world has to offer. However, the game courted controversy with the introduction of microtransactions that unfairly hindered players' ability to unlock the characters or items they needed reasonably, with random loot crates being equated to child gambling, which in essence I agree with. and is prevalent throughout most EA titles. Now, while EA backed down and altered the game to satiate the players' demands, albeit with a tremendous consumer backlash and the marching orders from Disney themselves swaying their stance in the end, the game still feels like a Star Wars version of EA's Call of Duty with elements of FIFA blended in for good measure. As a result, the game overall feels light on features, light on content, and ultimately unfulfilling in terms of an experience, despite the clear quality in its production, with no real glitches or bugs to speak of. A disappointment given how poor the initial installment of this rebooted series was, and when you break down how much content there actually is, that sense of being shortchanged just can't be shaken. I feel overall this game is a fantastic looking piece of hardware, but in terms of a game that leaves you feeling satiated and satisfied at the conclusion of its story, and in terms of replaying it purely for that and its gameplay mechanics, this game is sorely lacking. And its presentation, and indeed this choice to implement FIFA's microtransaction system, cannot be ignored as a blight on gaming as a whole.
And so we come to the verdict. Star Wars Battlefront 2. If I'm going to summarise it, it's a largely forgettable single-player experience, albeit with a few caveats here and there. The multiplayer mode is as you'd expect it to be, tons of fun if you're with mates, not so much if you're not. It's one of those games you really do need to have that kind of Halo-esque party for me to have that kind of experience where it's positive and fun at the same time. In terms of its staying power, I really haven't had the impetus to replay it. The only time I decided to pick up the game again after a protracted period of not playing it was when the DLC Resurrection came out. I'm glad I eventually played it, but at the same time it was kind of more of the same. It didn't add any additional elements, it didn't add anything that would entice me to replay through the game a second time. So on balance this game feels fairly average. If I'm going to put a rating on it, I would argue that it's more like a 6 out of 10, or maybe edging a 7 out of 10 if you give it a lot of credit for the idea behind its story. I would say that the clickbait ending of the first installment, in terms of teasing the fact that Iden Versio was Rey's mother, was kind of a silly idea in retrospect now that they've retconned it so that she has her own daughter who's now going to carry on the legacy. Maybe that was the idea all along, or maybe Disney and EA mutually decided to make sure that this particular game is distinguished from the movie so as to not harm its bottom line. And don't get me wrong, this game, I've tried to set aside that aspect of its concept and release as much as I can, but it can't be denied. EA's practices are hurting their franchises now, and it's fine. It's a good thing finally. Consumers are starting to speak up and say no to certain practices of the gaming industry. I, for one, don't pay for microtransactions. I never will, I never have, and never intend on doing so. If DLC comes and I feel the game's worthy of it, then yes, of course I'll part with some money. But more often than not, if you just wait long enough, special editions of the game come out with the DLC included anyway. In this case, I've yet to spend a penny beyond £15 on the original purchase price of the game, and I'd argue that's good value for money considering the graphics, the sound design, the overall fun I had playing it, and you got a cohesive story out of it. So I would recommend this to anyone who's never played the original Battlefront games, if not for the graphics and the simplicity of play. But for a hardcore Star Wars fan, I suggest give this one a miss. It's not critical to the canon of the story. It has the Battle of Jakku, which leads into the Force Awakens movies, but beyond that, you can give this one a miss and not worry too much. So thanks very much for watching this episode of the Halcyon Razor Review. Please like, share and subscribe. Check out some of the other content creators in the description below. As always, follow me on Twitter. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys on the next episode of the Halcyon Razor Review.